It's Thursday, October 17th, 2024, and we are 18 days away from the election. Welcome to today's Make It Make Sense mini episode. I'm Grant Harms. So today on the show, Kamala Harris goes on Fox News for a half-hour sit-down interview with Bret Baier, the cable network's chief political anchor and who they brand as the most middle-of-the-road anchor. The fact that Harris went on Fox at all is huge. Yes, surrogates from the campaign like Pete Buttigieg or even Tim Walz have gone on Fox, but it's a very different thing to have Harris go on an extremely unfriendly network. Now, there were a lot of Democrats and left-leaning pundits who told the Harris campaign, don't let her go on Fox. They thought it was a trap, but clearly the campaign thought that it was important to try and court anti-Trump voters, anti-Trump Republicans who watch Fox News, and to at least show an attempt at extending an olive branch. It's also worth pointing out that it is not something that Trump is doing in any capacity. You don't see Trump going on something like MSNBC. The interview, however, was hostile to say the least, and I think it's important to talk about the difference between an adversarial interview, which is what we think we normally want out of an interview, and a hostile one from the aspect of how you set it up as a journalist. So for starters, an adversarial interview is one in which the approach to the person you're interviewing is about actually gaining information from them, from their answers, for your audience. Yes, you hold them to their answers and you point out inconsistencies and you don't let them off the hook, but the aim is to uncover answers. Those are the 60 Minutes interviews, the editorial board interviews with the major papers. Those are the serious network sit-downs. A hostile interview is one where the goal is to fluster the person you're interviewing into making a mistake, and in hopes of using that mistake to exploit it, whether by that reporter or their news agency to make headlines, or by people who just don't like that person that you're interviewing. Usually that's done through things like setting up false premises or questions motivated by bad faith without a real want or desire to actually get information or get real answers. And one of the ways you can tell that that's happening is how often an interviewer interrupts the person that they're interviewing. It's a decent rule of thumb to say if the person being interviewed really can't get a word in edgewise because they keep getting cut off, something is up with this interview, and that's how this interview went. So it led off with immigration, and things were hot from the start.
How many illegal immigrants would you estimate your administration has released into the country over the last 3.5 years?
Well, I'm glad you raised the issue of immigration because I agree with you. It is a topic of discussion that people want to rightly have. And you know what I'm going to talk about.
Yeah, but just a number. Do you think it's 1 million, 3 million?
Brett, let's just get to the point. Okay, the point is that we have a broken immigration system that needs to be repaired.
So your Homeland Security Secretary said that 85% of apprehensions.
I'm not finished. We have an
it's a rough estimate of 6 million people have been released into the country. And let me just finish. I'll get to the question, I promise you.
I was beginning to answer.
And when you came into office, your administration immediately reversed a number of Trump border policies.
And that was just the first question. And the entire interview was pretty much like that. And I think it's worth pointing out here two things. First, yes, Harris has said in the past that she's been part of the decision-making on a lot of the consequential decisions in the Biden administration, which can be true, could be true, and could also just be her puffing herself up for campaign purposes. Both things can also be true at the same time. But the second thing, and the thing to keep in mind here, is that the vice presidency, for all intents and purposes, is really just the on-deck batter. They don't have any real power except for their obligations in the Senate. They can't sign laws. They can't sign off or rescind executive orders. They aren't the ones calling the shot as commander-in-chief. It's why we don't consider the Trump years as the Mike Pence administration or the Obama years as the Biden administration. Nobody is calling this the Harris administration except for Bret Baier. So to refer to the actions of the Biden administrations as her administration is pretty disingenuous. The interview continued for a little while, and then it came to a question about the ads the Trump campaign has been running for a while now, mostly in the swing states, and I've been seeing them here too in Massachusetts because they're airing in New Hampshire, where there's a pretty contentious race for governor there, but it's an ad where Harris is shown talking about supporting gender-affirming care for federal inmates and undocumented immigrants in detention centers. This was back in 2019, 2020. Here's some of the exchange after that ad was played.
So are you still in support of using taxpayer dollars to help prison inmates or detained illegal aliens to transition to another gender?
I will follow the law, and it's a law that Donald Trump actually followed. You're probably familiar with, now it's a public report, that under Donald Trump's administration, these surgeries were available on a medical necessity basis to people in the federal prison system. And I think, frankly, that ad from the Trump campaign is a little bit of like throwing stones when you're living in a glass house.
The Trump aides say that he never advocated for that prison policy and no gender transition surgeries
you know what, you got to take responsible for what happened
presidency.
in your administration.
Yeah, no surgeries happened in his presidency.
It's in black and white.
Would you still advocate for using taxpayer dollars for gender reassignment surgeries?
I will follow the law, just as I think Donald Trump would say he did.
You would have a say as president.
So, gender-affirming care, like hormone therapy, has been around in federal prisons since 2015 at least. And back in 2018, the Federal Bureau of Prisons said they had an obligation to provide medically necessary care to inmates under federal law, which can be things like hormone treatments, hair removal, and yes, even surgery. Now, that being said, trans care and trans surgeries certainly are not happening anywhere near often in prisons. The Bureau of Prisons estimates that there are 2,200 transgender inmates out of 156,000 total inmates. So that comes out to about less than 1/5 of 1% of all the inmates in the U.S. government's federal prison system. Or, in a number, 0.014%. And often when trans inmates do need gender-affirming care, they have to sue to get it, which means that even if every single trans inmate was lining up to get gender-affirming care in prisons, it isn't happening exactly when they ask for it. Now, likewise, under federal law, it's presumed that the Department of Homeland Security, which oversees immigration, would be obligated to care for trans immigrants who are under the care of the U.S. government. But I couldn't find a single record of it happening, and neither could numerous outlets, including factcheck.org, which checking facts is like their whole thing. But Immigration and Customs says they currently have 47 immigrants in their care who are considered transgender, though advocates say that is likely an undercount. Now, I can hear a lot of people out there saying, well, these people aren't citizens, they're criminals, and they don't deserve anything except for the bare minimum of medical care. But I'd argue that gender-affirming care is the minimum. For starters, trans inmates are much more likely to experience sexual assault in prisons. A study from the University of California, Irvine found that trans inmates are 13 times more likely to experience sexual assault. 59% said they had already been victims when this study was done, compared to less than 5% of the rest of the inmate population. The American Bar Association considers it a crisis in American prisons and said incarcerated transgender people experience a disproportionate and disturbing level of sexual violence in prisons and jails. And yes, prisons and jails are not meant to be fun places. They're meant to be places for punishment and rehabilitation. Not places, though, I would argue, that the government on our behalf turns a blind eye to suffering. And I didn't mean to linger on this. It's just the anti-trans attacks have been everywhere, and I just haven't had time to fit them into a show yet. And this show is all about context, and I felt like it was needed here. But let's move on. Harris and Baer continue to go back and forth on the economy, on foreign policy. Harris says a lot of the same things that I've talked about on this show before. Her answers, like I talked about in the other mini this week, her answers are pretty much on the talking points. Although at no point in this interview was abortion talked about, which was odd, given Harris's past, talking about it, and given that the network had just done a town hall with Donald Trump all about, with and for, women. So ostensibly, the network would want to know Harris's thoughts too, to be able to have footage to compare and contrast for their viewers. Now, the last maybe third of the interview was about Biden and his mental fitness. Again, not exactly relevant to the election right now, seeing as Biden isn't the candidate, but it led to what was the question and the answer, I think, of the night. Here it is.
So, you're not Joe Biden, you're not Donald Trump, but nothing comes to mind that you would do differently?
Let me be very clear. My presidency will not be a continuation of Joe Biden's presidency. And like every new president that comes into office, I will bring my life experiences, my professional experiences, and fresh and new ideas. I represent a new generation of leadership.
So that is something that Harris has been absolutely reluctant to say at almost every turn. Now, it's not a coincidence she said it here on Fox, where she's trying to court those anti-Trump Republican voters. But for her to say this at all might send ripples through patches of Democratic voters who are getting cold feet about Harris here in these final days for one reason or another. It's also the first time that she's made such a clean break from the Biden administration, instead of trying to live in a place that's somewhere between being an incumbent and being the new chapter. Whether that will work with those voters is something that we'll have to wait and see, but it was definitely the moment from the entire night. Okay, that is it for today's MIMS Mini. Thank you so much for listening. Please rate and review this show on whatever podcast app you're listening to this on. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications on YouTube. Also subscribe to the Make It Make Sense Substack, where I've got bonus content up there. And as always, continue to share the show on social media. It's MIMS News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod, all one word on every platform. I am at Grant Herms on X and at Grant Herms TV on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Grant Herms, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.